Night settles over the Great Victoria Desert like a crimson sea of silence. From space, this vast expanse of red sand glows faintly under starlight, its endless dunes breathing with the slow rhythm of a sleeping continent. To most, it appears empty. 350 square kilometers of nothing but heat, wind, and solitude. But what if that emptiness is an illusion? Deep beneath these scarlet waves, satellites are detecting something extraordinary. Geometric patterns too precise to be natural. Straight lines that shouldn't exist. The ghostly outlines of walls, streets, and courtyards buried under centuries of sand. Each discovery whispers the same impossible question. Could Australia's first cities be sleeping beneath our feet? Tonight we'll journey into the heart of this red mystery. We'll follow the traces of ancient rivers that once carved through paradise, walk among painted caves that still echo with forgotten voices, and discover how an entire civilization might have vanished into legend, only to be awakened again by the patient eyes of modern science. So settle back, breathe deeply, and let the desert's ancient lullaby carry you into a world where the red earth remembers everything, and silence itself becomes a keeper of secrets. The story begins in darkness, as all the best stories do. Night falls across the Great Victoria Desert like a velvet curtain drawn over the world's largest stage. From the International Space Station, astronaut Dr. Sarah Wellington once described this moment as watching a crimson ocean exhale its last breath of heat into the cosmos. The desert stretches endlessly below, 348,150 square kilometers of undulating red sand that catches starlight and holds it like scattered diamonds on burgundy silk. Each dune rises and falls with the patient rhythm of a sleeping giant, and in that rhythm lies a secret that has waited 40,000 years to be told. To the untrained eye scanning satellite imagery, this appears to be nothing more than Australia's great emptiness, a void where civilization never took hold, where only the hardiest creatures survive on thorns and morning dew. But Dr. Wellington and her colleagues at the Australian Archaeological Survey have begun to see something different in those same images. Hidden beneath the deceptive simplicity of endless sand lies what may be the most extraordinary archive on Earth, a library written not in books or stone tablets, but in the very bones of the landscape itself. The Great Victoria wasn't always a desert. Geological evidence reveals that this scarlet wasteland once bloomed with rivers so vast they would dwarf the Murray, forests so dense they sheltered creatures that no longer walk this continent, and lakes so clear they mirrored skies heavy with promise. Professor Thomas Hartwell of the University of Adelaide has spent the last 15 years studying what he calls the great amnesia of the Australian interior. Through ground-penetrating radar and satellite, thermal imaging, his team has mapped an intricate network of paleo-rivers, ghost waterways that once carved deep channels through what is now lifeless sand. These ancient arteries tell a story of abundance that challenges everything we thought we knew about Australia's prehistoric landscape. The evidence is overwhelming, yet it whispers rather than shouts, hidden beneath layers of time and sediment that have accumulated like dust on a forgotten photograph. Where today only spinifex grass and bloodwood trees struggle against the relentless sun, massive freshwater crocodiles once basked beside rivers wider than the Thames. Where silence now reigns absolute, the air once hummed with millions of insects, the splash of water birds, and perhaps something else. The voices of people who understood this landscape not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living entity to be read and respected. These weren't nomadic hunter-gatherers scraping out a bare existence. Archaeological evidence suggests communities sophisticated enough to predict seasonal changes, map celestial movements, and create art that still moves the soul 40 millennia later. Dr. Margaret Thorne, a paleoclimatologist at Griffith University, has reconstructed the climate patterns that transformed this region from Eden to wasteland. Using isotope analysis from ancient soil samples, her research reveals that between 50,000 and 35,000 years ago, the Great Victoria experienced what she terms the long bloom, a period when reliable monsoons brought life-sustaining rains far into the continental interior. During these millennia, the desert as we know it simply did not exist. In its place stretched an interconnected ecosystem of wetlands, woodlands, and grasslands that supported not just wildlife, but human communities of remarkable complexity. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Climate change operated on a geological timescale, allowing generations to adapt, migrate, and preserve their knowledge through oral tradition and artistic expression. But when the rains finally failed for the last time, when the last permanent waterholes dried to cracked earth, something extraordinary happened. Rather than simply vanishing into archaeological obscurity, these communities appear to have deliberately buried their most sacred sites, creating time capsules that would survive the coming drought. It's as if they knew their world was ending, and chose to leave messages for whoever might one day walk these red sands again. Tonight, as you listen to this story from wherever you are, perhaps in a comfortable chair by a window, or lying in bed as the day's weight settles into your shoulders, imagine that same quietude stretching across a continent. Picture the Great Victoria under starlight, its endless dunes breathing with the rhythm of deep sleep. Somewhere beneath that crimson silence, sophisticated minds once gazed up at these same constellations and wondered about their place in the cosmos. They created calendars from starlight, medicines from desert plants, and stories that transformed survival into something approaching art. Dr. Andrew Sterling, director of the Remote Sensing Archaeological Project, believes we're on the verge of the most significant discovery in Australian prehistory. His team's latest satellite surveys have identified geometric anomalies scattered across the desert, patterns too regular, too purposeful to be natural formations. These aren't random artifacts scattered by wind and time. They appear to be the deliberate architectural signatures of permanent settlements, possibly connected by trade routes that spanned hundreds of kilometers. The implications are staggering. If Sterling is correct, the Great Victoria may have once supported Australia's first urban civilization, a network of communities that flourished for millennia before climate change forced them to abandon their homeland and carry their accumulated wisdom to distant shores. But before we can understand what was lost, we must first witness what was found. Close your eyes and travel backward through time, past the memory of human civilization, past the last ice age, to a moment 45,000 years ago, when the Great Victoria Desert existed only as a dream yet to be born. The landscape that greets your imagination bears no resemblance to today's crimson wasteland. Instead of endless dunes stretching toward empty horizons, picture an ocean of emerald grass swaying beneath a sky painted in shades of violet and gold. The air hangs thick with humidity, carrying the intoxicating fragrance of wet earth and blooming wattle trees whose golden flowers dust the morning breeze with pollen like scattered sunshine. Dr. Patricia Langford, Australia's leading expert in Pleistocene ecology, has spent 2 decades reconstructing this lost world through fossil evidence and computer modeling. Her research reveals a continent transformed, where massive freshwater lakes mirrored clouds so brilliant they appeared to be fragments of heaven fallen to earth. These weren't temporary water bodies formed by seasonal flooding, but permanent inland seas that supported ecosystems of breathtaking diversity. Lake systems stretched across what is now the heart of the desert, connected by rivers that carved deep channels through landscapes green beyond modern comprehension. The largest of these ancient lakes, which Langford has named Lake Aurelia, covered an area larger than Tasmania, its shores lined with forests that rang with the calls of creatures both familiar and utterly alien to contemporary Australia. From the Flinders Ranges to the Western Basins, the Great Victoria pulsed with life on a scale that defies modern imagination. Giant kangaroos, some standing nearly 3 meters tall, bounded through valleys carpeted with native grasses that grew waist-high across endless plains. These weren't the familiar red kangaroos of today's outback, but massive creatures called Procoptodon, short-faced kangaroos with powerful jaws designed to process the tough vegetation of a wetter world. Alongside them grazed Diprotodon, marsupials the size of small automobiles, their barrel-shaped bodies perfectly adapted for browsing the abundant shrubs and low-hanging branches of ancient eucalyptus forests. Professor James Whittaker, a paleontologist at the Australian National University, describes these megafauna as the architects of their ecosystem. Their massive size and constant movement created pathways through dense vegetation that smaller animals followed for generations, establishing migration routes that connected water sources across hundreds of kilometers. When the Diprotodon moved in their seasonal patterns, they carried seeds in their fur and digestive systems, spreading plant species far beyond their original habitats. The landscape itself was shaped by their presence, molded by countless generations of giants who understood the rhythms of this green world with an intimacy that modern science can only approximate through careful reconstruction of fossilized evidence. But perhaps the most extraordinary inhabitants of this lost Eden were the freshwater crocodiles that basked along riverbanks beside reeds twice a human's height. These weren't the relatively modest saltwater crocodiles of northern Australia, but massive prehistoric species like Palimnarchus and Quincana, some reaching lengths of 7 meters or more. Dr. Rachel Pemberton's groundbreaking research at the University of Western Australia has revealed that these ancient predators occupied ecological niches that no longer exist, thriving in the vast river systems that connected the inland lakes. Her team's analysis of bite marks on fossilized bones suggests these crocodiles hunted not just fish and water birds, but occasionally the juvenile megafauna that came to drink at the water's edge. Above this aquatic paradise, enormous flocks of birds painted the sky in living murals that shifted and swirled with the seasons. Thunderbirds, massive raptors with wingspans exceeding 4 meters, soared on thermals rising from sun-warmed grasslands, their keen eyes scanning for prey among the herds below. Flocks of giant emus, some standing nearly 2.5 meters tall, rose from lakes so vast they shimmered at the horizon like inland seas, their calls echoing across distances that would take days to traverse on foot. The very air vibrated with life. Millions of insects, the splash of diving birds, and the deep, resonant calls of creatures for whom this abundance was simply the natural order of existence. This was Australia's Pleistocene wet phase, a geological epoch when the planet's subtle orbital dance drew monsoon systems far south of their current boundaries. Dr. Cameron Fletcher, a climatologist at Macquarie University, has modeled these ancient weather patterns using supercomputer simulations that reveal how slight changes in Earth's axial tilt could transform an entire continent. The monsoons arrived with clockwork regularity, carrying moisture-laden air masses from tropical oceans deep into what is now the continental interior. Rain fell in quantities that modern Australia has never experienced, filling vast catchment areas and creating river systems that dwarfed anything in the contemporary landscape. From orbital perspective, this green Australia must have resembled a second Amazon, its canopy catching sunlight and releasing it as clouds that seeded even more precipitation in an endless cycle of abundance. Satellite radar technology now reveals ghostly traces of this vanished paradise. Dry channels braided like silver roots across the desert floor, crescent ridges marking ancient shorelines, and circular depressions where permanent springs once bubbled up from deep aquifers. Each curve in these phantom waterways tells a story of ebb and flow, of seasonal floods that renewed the soil and dry seasons that concentrated wildlife around reliable water sources. Yet in this seemingly endless paradise, the first stirrings of human consciousness were beginning to emerge, and with them, questions that would echo across 40,000 years. Deep in the heart of the Great Victoria, where shifting dunes create temporary sculptures that vanish with the next wind, archaeologists discovered something that would rewrite our understanding of Australia's ancient past. The site, which remains classified to protect it from looters, was revealed purely by chance when a particularly violent sandstorm in 2019 stripped away layers of sediment that had accumulated over millennia. Dr. Samantha Garrett, lead researcher for the Central Australian Archaeological Project, recalls the moment her team first glimpsed bone fragments glinting in the afternoon sun like scattered pearls on red velvet. What they found beneath that thin crust of sand defied every expectation about prehistoric Australia. This wasn't the random scattering of remains that wind and weather typically leave behind, but something far more profound and intentional. Carefully arranged along the ancient shoreline of a lake that dried up 40,000 years ago, lay what can only be described as a sacred cemetery, the oldest known burial ground in the southern hemisphere. The skeletons weren't simply deposited by natural forces or hastily covered after death, but positioned with deliberate care and meaning that speaks to sophisticated cultural practices among Australia's earliest inhabitants. Each burial told a story of reverence and love that transcends the vast gulf of time separating us from these ancient peoples. One discovery in particular captured the imagination of researchers worldwide. A woman lying on her side with two small children nestled against her body, their tiny hands still touching across 40 millennia. Around these ancient remains, Dr. Garrett's team uncovered artifacts that revealed the sophistication of Australia's earliest cultures. Delicately carved beads fashioned from freshwater mussel shells, each one polished to a lustrous finish that still catches light after countless centuries buried in sand. Stone projectile points napped with such precision that modern flint knapping experts struggle to replicate their elegant symmetry. Most remarkably, microscopic analysis revealed pollen grains scattered throughout the burial sites, the ghostly remnants of flowers that had been placed with the dead as final offerings of beauty and remembrance. Professor Nancy Ashworth, a leading expert in prehistoric Australian cultures at the University of Adelaide, describes these discoveries as evidence of humanity's earliest expressions of grief, love, and hope for continuity beyond death. The positioning of bodies, the careful selection of grave goods, and the inclusion of organic materials that would have been precious in their harsh environment all point to burial practices that were anything but primitive. These people understood death not as an ending, but as a transformation requiring ceremonial recognition. They buried not just bodies, but memories, stories, and perhaps even hopes that their loved ones would somehow continue their journey in another realm. The discovery that truly transformed our understanding of these ancient peoples came from an unexpected source. Footprints preserved in what was once wet clay beside the ancient lake. Dr. William Foster, a specialist in prehistoric human behavior at Charles Darwin University, led the painstaking excavation that revealed a single moment frozen in time 40,000 years ago. The tracks tell an intimate story, a family walking together across damp ground after seasonal rains had filled the lake basin. An adult's prints stride confidently forward, while smaller impressions, clearly those of children, weave playfully around them. Most poignantly, the delicate paw marks of a dingo cross the same path, suggesting that even Australia's earliest inhabitants had formed bonds with the wild dogs that would eventually become their companions in survival. These fossilized footprints dried quickly in the ancient sun, sealed by a thin layer of fine sediment, and remained perfectly preserved until the present day. Each toe impression, each subtle shift in weight distribution as the walkers navigated uneven ground, provides forensic evidence of people who moved with purpose and confidence through their green world. Carbon dating of organic materials found within the same clay layers confirms these tracks were made during the height of the Great Victoria's fertile period, when this region supported not just scattered hunter-gatherer bands, but established communities with sophisticated knowledge of their environment's rhythms and resources. Dr. Maria Reynolds, a forensic anthropologist who has analyzed the burial practices at this remarkable site, believes we are witnessing evidence of Australia's first complex societies. The care taken in positioning bodies, the standardization of burial orientations, most facing east toward the sunrise, and the consistent inclusion of grave goods suggest shared cultural beliefs and practices that were passed down through generations. Some skeletons rest with their arms folded across their chests, in poses that mirror burial customs found in other parts of the world thousands of years later. Others are accompanied by collections of carefully selected stones, each one worn smooth by handling, as if they had served as tools for counting or perhaps as talismans carrying spiritual significance. The isotopic analysis of teeth from these ancient remains reveals diets rich in freshwater fish and aquatic plants, confirming that these people lived intimately connected to the lake ecosystems that sustained them. But more than mere survival, the evidence points to communities with time for reflection, ceremony, and the creation of meaning from loss. They transformed the universal human experience of grief into something beautiful and enduring, creating rituals that honored both the dead and the living who would carry their memories forward. Yet even as these remarkable people thrived beside their inland seas, they were already creating something that would outlast their green paradise. In the heart of the desert, where the sun has bleached stone into bone-white monuments to eternity, color still clings to life with stubborn defiance. If you walk through the narrow gorges that cut through the eastern reaches of the Great Victoria, the silence feels sacred, almost cathedral-like in its profound stillness. Each footstep echoes through corridors of sandstone that rise like the ribs of some ancient cathedral, and each breath seems to carry whispers from ages long past. Look closely at these towering walls, and you will discover something that defies both time and the relentless erosion of 40,000 years. Color persists here, holding fast to rock surfaces with an almost supernatural tenacity. Earthy reds, golden ochres, charcoal blacks, thousands of human and animal figures dance across the stone in eternal procession. Dr. Jennifer Hawthorne, Australia's foremost expert in prehistoric rock art, describes her first encounter with these galleries as stepping into the dreams of the ancients. Her research team has catalogued over 15,000 individual images scattered across more than 200 cave systems, each one a window into a world that modern Australia has forgotten, but these stone canvases have preserved with perfect clarity. These are not random decorations or idle doodles created during moments of boredom. They represent something far more profound, a visual language that spoke across generations, a library of knowledge written in pigment and passion on walls that would outlast every other human creation. The figures that emerge from these ancient walls tell stories that span millennia of human experience in the green Great Victoria. Dancers with arms raised skyward in celebration or supplication, their bodies elongated and flowing as if caught in eternal motion. Swimmers gliding through painted waters that once reflected real skies, their strokes captured with such precision that you can almost see the ripples spreading from their movements. Herders guiding processions of animals through landscapes lush with vegetation. Rain falling in delicate dots around human figures who seem to dance with joy at the sky's abundance. Professor Alan Winters, a specialist in Aboriginal cultural studies at the University of Melbourne, has spent decades learning to read these stone galleries like ancient newspapers. Each painting layer reveals different eras of occupation, different artistic styles that evolved as communities adapted to their changing environment. The oldest images, painted during the height of the wet period, burst with life and movement. Giant kangaroos bound across rock faces beside humans who appear to celebrate their shared abundance. Later paintings, created as the climate began to shift, show more careful planning and resource management, images of water collection, seasonal camps, and the deliberate herding practices that would become essential as reliable water sources grew scarce. The technical mastery displayed in these ancient galleries rivals anything found in prehistoric art worldwide. Dr. Rebecca Thornfield, a chemist specializing in ancient pigments, has analyzed the mineral compositions used by these Stone Age artists and discovered sophisticated knowledge of color preparation and preservation. The vibrant reds come from iron oxides ground to powder and mixed with binding agents made from tree saps and animal fats. The deep blacks derive from manganese oxides, while the golden yellows were created from limonite clays that required careful heating to achieve their luminous quality. Some pigments contain trace elements that could only have been obtained from specific geological formations hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting extensive trade networks that connected communities across the continent. Perhaps most remarkably, many paintings show evidence of deliberate layering techniques that created depth and movement. Artists would apply base colors, allow them to dry, then add details with different pigments to create images that seem to shift and flow in changing light. When viewed by flickering firelight, as they would have been by their creators, these ancient masterpieces come alive with an almost cinematic quality. The dancing figures actually appear to dance. The swimming forms seem to glide through their painted pools, and the herded animals move in eternal procession across stone landscapes that once mirrored the green world outside. These cave galleries represent far more than artistic expression. They constitute humanity's earliest attempts to create permanent records of knowledge, belief, and cultural identity. Dr. Michelle Patterson, an anthropologist who has studied the social significance of rock art across multiple continents, argues that these paintings mark a crucial evolutionary leap in human consciousness. The act of transforming lived experience into symbolic representation requires abstract thinking, long-term planning, and a sophisticated understanding of how images can communicate across time and space. The artists who created these galleries were not simply decorating their living spaces, but deliberately constructing messages for future generations. The recurring motifs scattered across hundreds of cave systems suggest shared cultural beliefs that unified communities across vast distances. Spiral patterns that may represent waterholes or seasonal cycles appear alongside geometric designs that could indicate territorial boundaries or astronomical observations. Hand stencils, created by blowing pigment around hands pressed against stone, appear in caves separated by hundreds of kilometers, as if ancient artists were signing their names across the landscape. These weren't random creative impulses, but elements of a complex visual language that helped bind together a civilization spread across an area larger than many modern nations. Yet even as these artists immortalized their green world in stone, forces beyond their control were already reshaping the very foundations of their existence. The stories of lost worlds did not begin with satellites or sonar, with ground-penetrating radar or computer simulations. They began with memory, ancient, persistent, and strangely universal. Long before modern technology revealed the buried rivers beneath the Great Victoria Desert, humanity whispered of civilizations swallowed by sand and sea. Across continents and languages, through cultures separated by vast oceans and millennia of time, the same haunting refrain appeared like an echo that refuses to fade. There was once a world of harmony and knowledge, now gone. To the ancient Greeks, it was Atlantis, Plato's island of wisdom consumed by the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophe. To the seafaring cultures of the Pacific, it was Mu, the lost continent of peace and advanced learning that sank beneath the waves when its people forgot the sacred laws that governed their existence. To the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, it was the dream time, that mystical era when ancestral beings walked the earth as giants, shaping rivers and mountains, teaching the laws of survival, and creating the songlines that would guide their descendants through an ever-changing world. Dr. Eleanor Fitzgerald, a comparative mythology professor at Princeton University, has spent her career studying these persistent legends of lost paradises. Her research reveals striking parallels between cultures that had no known contact with each other, suggesting what she calls the universal memory of abundance, a collective human recollection of times when the earth provided, more generously than our recorded history suggests, was ever possible. Were these merely coincidental myths born from humanity's longing for a perfect world that never existed? Or could they be fragmented memories of real places, real times, when the Earth's climate supported civilizations that thrived and vanished before the dawn of written history? The question becomes more compelling when we examine the specific details embedded within these ancient stories. The legends of Mu, first recorded by Pacific Island cultures and later compiled by researchers in the early 20th century, speak of a vast southern continent where the first keepers of knowledge lived in harmony with natural cycles. This lost land was described as red in color, blessed with inland seas, and inhabited by people who understood astronomy, agriculture, and the sacred geometry that connected earth to sky. Professor Graham Aldridge, a specialist in Pacific mythology at the University of Hawaii, has traced these Mu traditions across dozens of island cultures, from Polynesia to Micronesia. Despite their geographic separation, these societies preserved remarkably consistent descriptions of the southern continent's characteristics. They spoke of red earth that glowed like fire under the setting sun, of vast lakes that reflected the Southern Cross, and of wise teachers who mapped the movements of stars before the great waters withdrew, and the red land became a place of silence. When 19th-century explorers first ventured into Australia's interior, they were struck by the uncanny resemblance between these Pacific legends and the landscape they encountered. The red earth of the Great Victoria Desert seemed to match ancient descriptions perfectly, while the dry lake beds scattered across the region suggested that vast bodies of water had indeed once existed, where now only salt and sand remained. Dr. Sophia Pembroke, a historical linguist who has studied the evolution of Pacific Island oral traditions, believes these stories represent genuine cultural memory passed down through hundreds of generations. Her analysis of linguistic patterns within Mu legends reveals consistent terminology for astronomical phenomena, seasonal changes, and geographic features that correspond remarkably well with the environmental conditions that would have existed in prehistoric Australia during its wet phases. The skeptical mind naturally questions whether these connections represent anything more than coincidental similarities between myth and geology. Yet the precision of certain details within the Mu traditions challenges casual dismissal. Ancient Polynesian navigation chants contain references to a southern landmass characterized by rivers that snake through red valleys and lakes that birth the morning mist, descriptions that eerily parallel satellite imagery of the Great Victoria's buried watershed systems. Most intriguingly, some Pacific Island cultures preserved mathematical concepts related to calculating distances to southern lands, suggesting their ancestors possessed practical knowledge of real geographic relationships rather than purely mythical ones. The Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories add another layer to this tapestry of ancient memory. Dr. Timothy Norwood, an anthropologist who has worked with traditional storytellers across Central Australia for over 3 decades, has documented oral histories that speak of a time when the red heart of the continent bloomed with life. These stories, passed down through countless generations, describe ancestral beings who created the landscape during an epoch when the sky spirits brought endless rain and the earth sang with many waters. The rainbow serpent, one of the most important figures in Aboriginal mythology, is said to have carved the great rivers that once flowed through what is now desert, creating a network of waterways that connected distant tribes and allowed knowledge to flow like the waters themselves. What makes these Aboriginal accounts particularly compelling is their integration of practical survival knowledge with mythological narrative. The songlines that crisscross the continent encode information about water sources, seasonal patterns, and safe traveling routes, many of which lead to locations that satellite archaeology now reveals as former lake beds or buried river channels. It's as if the Dreamtime stories serve as both spiritual teachings and ancient GPS systems, preserving geographic knowledge of a landscape that ceased to exist long before European exploration began. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not whether these legends remember real places, but whether those places might someday return to life. Long before the pyramids rose from the Nile Valley, long before Stonehenge cast its shadows across the English countryside, a smaller circle of standing stones waited in patient silence beneath the southern stars. Hidden now within the heart of the Great Victoria Desert, half buried by millennia of shifting sand, half forgotten by a world that has lost the art of reading the sky, this modest monument represents one of humanity's most profound intellectual achievements. To the untrained eye scanning the endless red expanse, it might appear unremarkable. A few weathered slabs forming a humble circle surrounded by faint mounds of wind-sculpted earth. But the eye that lingers begins to sense a pattern, a purpose that transcends the simple arrangement of stone and space. Dr. Amanda Prescott, one of the world's leading experts in prehistoric astronomy, recalls her first visit to this remote site as a moment of pure revelation. Standing among these ancient markers as the sun set behind her and the first stars appeared overhead, she realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not random placement of stones by nomadic peoples, but precise architectural intention that required generations of careful observation, mathematical understanding, and collaborative effort. When Prescott's team first measured the alignments using modern surveying equipment and computerized celestial calculations, they discovered that these stones had not been positioned at random. Each pair pointed with deliberate precision toward specific astronomical phenomena, creating what can only be described as a calendar carved in stone. One pair of megaliths frames the sunrise on the summer solstice with mathematical accuracy, marking the longest day of the year when the green Victoria would have experienced its peak growing season. Another alignment tracks the heliacal rising of the Southern Cross and Alpha Centauri, celestial events that would have signaled crucial seasonal transitions to communities dependent on predictable weather patterns. Perhaps most remarkably, a third set of stones follows the complex orbital dance of the Magellanic Clouds, those satellite galaxies visible only from the southern hemisphere whose movements require sophisticated understanding of long-term astronomical cycles. Professor Harold Quincy, an archaeoastronomer at the Australian National University, has spent 15 years studying this site and similar stone circles scattered across the continent's interior. His research reveals that these ancient astronomers possessed knowledge that rivals modern understanding of celestial mechanics. They tracked not only obvious phenomena like solstices and equinoxes, but subtle variations in stellar positions that occur over centuries. Their observations were so precise that Quincy's team can use the stone alignments to calculate backward through time, determining exactly when the monuments were constructed based on the positions of stars that have since shifted due to Earth's axial precession. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond simple timekeeping. During the Great Victoria's fertile period, this astronomical observatory would have served as the technological and spiritual center of a sophisticated society. Dr. Catherine Melbourne, a specialist in prehistoric social organization, argues that the construction and maintenance of such precise stellar calendars required not just individual genius, but coordinated effort across generations. Families would have dedicated their lives to sky watching, passing down mathematical knowledge and observational techniques through oral tradition with the same precision that modern universities preserve scientific knowledge in written form. The stones themselves tell stories of incredible logistical achievement. Each megalith weighs several tons and would have required organized teams to transport from quarry sites located dozens of kilometers away. The precision of their placement demanded not only brute strength, but sophisticated understanding of geometry, surveying techniques, and architectural planning. Most remarkably, the entire complex appears to have been designed as a unified system rather than individual monuments built at different times, suggesting that its creators possessed a comprehensive vision of how celestial observations could be translated into permanent earthly markers. Carbon dating of organic materials found buried around the stone bases confirms that this observatory operated continuously for over 3,000 years, making it one of the longest functioning scientific institutions in human history. The beauty of this ancient achievement lies not only in its scientific precision, but in its profound integration of practical knowledge with spiritual understanding. To these early astronomers, watching the stars was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a sacred duty that connected their community to the cosmic order. Dr. Patricia Fullerton, an ethnomusicologist who has studied traditional Aboriginal star songs, believes the observatory served as both calendar and cathedral, a place where mathematical observation merged seamlessly with ceremonial practice. The positioning of the stones creates acoustic properties that amplify human voices in specific directions, suggesting that astronomical observations were accompanied by chants or songs that helped preserve crucial timing information across generations. Standing among these weathered monuments today, as the same constellations wheel overhead that guided their builders 40,000 years ago, one cannot help but feel humbled by the depth of knowledge these ancient peoples achieved without telescopes, computers, or written records. They read the sky with patience and precision that modern astronomers respect and admire, creating a technology that outlasted their green world and continues to mark time even as the desert around it sleeps. Yet even as these master astronomers perfected their celestial calculations, forces beyond their control were already beginning to reshape the very foundations of their paradise, setting in motion changes that would test every survival skill their accumulated wisdom had taught them. Change does not announce itself with thunder. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first gray threads that appear in a loved one's hair, or the subtle settling of an old house that speaks of foundations shifting beneath. For those who lived in the green Great Victoria, the end must have come not with catastrophe, but with silence, a gradual fading that took generations to complete and lifetimes to understand. Dr. Victoria Ashford, a paleoclimatologist at the University of Sydney, has dedicated her career to reconstructing the precise timeline of Australia's greatest environmental transformation. Through her analysis of sediment cores, pollen samples, and isotopic data, she has created what amounts to a medical record of a dying ecosystem. The changes began subtly around 37,000 years ago, with summers that brought slightly less rainfall than the previous year, winds that lingered a bit longer from the north, and lake levels that dropped by inches rather than feet. 2. Communities that had lived for thousands of years with the reliable rhythm of wet and dry seasons, these variations might have seemed like natural fluctuations, temporary inconveniences that time and patience would eventually correct. But the silence grew deeper each year. The evening chorus of frogs that had serenaded countless generations began to thin and fade. Grass that had once grown thick enough to hide a walking person became sparse and patchy. The mighty rivers that had braided through the plains for millennia started to fragment into smaller channels, then chains of isolated pools, then memories preserved only in dry creek beds. Within the span of just a few generations, paradise began to unravel. Professor Kenneth Dalton, a specialist in prehistoric environmental change at Charles Darwin University, describes this period as the long goodbye, a gradual withdrawal of the conditions that had sustained complex ecosystems for tens of thousands of years. His research team has mapped the retreat with heartbreaking precision, tracking how Lake Aurelia, once larger than Tasmania, slowly contracted toward its center as evaporation exceeded rainfall year after year. The process was so gradual that shoreline communities could literally watch their world shrink, marking new high water lines each season as the lake pulled further away from settlements that had been built assuming permanence. The scientific evidence for this transformation reads like a coroner's report on a dying continent. At an ancient lakebed in the northern reaches of the Great Victoria, sediment cores drilled deep into preserved mud layers reveal a perfect timeline of ecological collapse. Around 35,000 years ago, microscopic analysis shows that layers rich with freshwater diatoms, tiny glass-shelled algae that thrive in clear, clean water, suddenly disappear from the geological record. In their place appear salt-tolerant species that could survive only in increasingly saline conditions, as concentrated minerals replaced the fresh water that had sustained life for millennia. This shift marks the exact moment when the monsoon system collapsed and the final wet phase of the Great Victoria came to an end. Dr. Rebecca Thornfield, whose earlier work analyzed the pigments of ancient cave art, has expanded her research to examine the pollen preserved in these same sediment layers. Her microscopic investigations reveal a botanical apocalypse unfolding in slow motion. Native grasses giving way to saltbush, woodland species disappearing entirely, and the diverse plant communities that had supported complex food webs gradually replaced by the sparse, drought-resistant vegetation that characterizes the modern desert. The human response to these changes can be tracked through archaeological layers that mirror the environmental collapse. Pottery from the final humid period shows desperate innovation as communities adapted to increasingly scarce water resources. Vessels designed with narrower necks to minimize evaporation, larger storage jars meant to capture and preserve every drop of seasonal rainfall, and containers sealed with plant resins in attempts to maintain precious moisture through the dry months. Tool assemblages reveal new priorities as well. An increase in specialized fishing equipment as rivers became isolated pools, more sophisticated hunting implements as large game grew scarce, and the first appearance of deep well digging tools as surface water became unreliable. In nearby rock shelters, the art of this period undergoes a profound transformation that reflects the changing world outside. The elegant swimmers and lush herding scenes that had adorned cave walls for thousands of years gradually disappear, replaced by rougher sketches of survival. Detailed maps of remaining water sources, careful recordings of seasonal patterns, and increasingly abstract spiritual imagery that suggests communities turning inward as their external world contracted. Dr. Michelle Patterson, whose anthropological work had previously focused on the social significance of rock art, now found herself documenting what she calls the archaeology of adaptation. These later paintings show evidence of hasty execution, as if their creators were racing against time to preserve crucial knowledge before their communities dispersed. Around 33,000 years ago, the dunes began their inexorable advance. Satellite imagery combined with geological analysis reveals the speed of this final transformation. Sand ridges migrating southward at measurable rates, swallowing entire landscapes in geological slow motion. Oases that had sustained life for millennia vanished one by one, their locations now marked only by subtle variations in soil chemistry, detectable through spectrographic analysis. The people who had called this green world home faced an impossible choice: follow the retreating rains southward into unfamiliar territories, or adapt to an increasingly harsh environment that offered fewer resources each passing year. What they chose in those final generations would determine not only their own survival, but the future course of human civilization across an entire continent, as ancient knowledge began its journey toward distant shores where new rivers still flowed. From above, the Great Victoria appears endless, an ocean of light, heat, and profound silence stretching toward every horizon like a meditation on emptiness itself. To the satellite cameras that orbit overhead, capturing images of this vast red expanse every few days, the desert seems locked in eternal stillness, a landscape where nothing moves except the slow dance of sand shifting with the wind. But this tranquility is perhaps the greatest illusion on Earth. Beneath the undulating dunes lies another world entirely, a hidden realm shaped not by wind and weathering, but by the patient persistence of water. Dr. Andrew Whitfield, director of the Australian Hydrological Survey, has spent the last decade learning to read the secret language written beneath the desert's surface. Using ground-penetrating radar, magnetometer surveys, and advanced satellite imaging techniques, his team has discovered what he calls the most extensive fossil river system on any continent. A vast network of buried waterways that once pulsed through the Great Victoria like arteries through a living body. These are not random geological formations or ancient lava tubes, but carefully mapped drainage patterns that reveal the ghost of a landscape so different from today's reality that it challenges our fundamental understanding of how quickly environments can transform. Hidden deep below the deceptive simplicity of endless sand, radar sensors and satellite instruments detect the spectral traces of ancient rivers that once carried more water than the Amazon, supported ecosystems more diverse than the Congo Basin, and nourished civilizations whose scope we are only beginning to comprehend. They are called the sleeping rivers of the Great Victoria, and the largest among them is a colossus that Whitfield's team has designated the Great Southern Serpent. If this buried waterway flowed today, it would rival the Murray River in scale and surpass it in grandeur, stretching nearly 800 kilometers from source to sea, draining an area larger than the state of Victoria itself. Its ancient channel begins high in the Flinders Ranges, where seasonal rains once collected in vast catchment basins, then threads through the heart of the desert in sweeping meanders that speak of millennia of patient erosion and deposition. Professor Linda Harrington, a geomorphologist at the University of Adelaide, has traced the serpent's complete course using a combination of satellite thermal imaging and seismic surveys. Her research reveals that this mighty river didn't simply meander randomly across the landscape, but followed geological weak points with the precision of an engineer, carving through resistant rock formations and depositing fertile sediments in exactly the locations where they would do the most good for plant growth and soil development. The river's path reads like a blueprint for sustainable agriculture, connecting highland water sources to lowland growing areas through a network of tributaries that distributed resources with remarkable efficiency. During the last Green Victoria period, about 40,000 years ago, this buried colossus would have been a superhighway of life, connecting inland lake systems to the Indian Ocean through what is now Perth's coastal plain. Dr. Timothy Bradford, a hydrologist specializing in paleo-river reconstruction, has used computer modeling to simulate the serpent's flow patterns during peak wet periods. His calculations suggest that at maximum capacity, this ancient river carried enough water to fill Sydney Harbour every 3 days, creating deltas, wetlands, and floodplains that supported wildlife populations, rivaling those of modern Africa's great river systems. The serpent was not alone in this buried landscape. Whitfield's team has identified dozens of smaller paleo-rivers threading through the desert's subsurface: the Twilight Creek system that once drained the northwestern quadrant, the Silver Valley network that collected runoff from Central Highlands, and the mysterious Deep Channel that appears to connect underground aquifers across hundreds of kilometers. Each of these sleeping waterways tells part of a larger story about how water moved through this ancient ecosystem, carrying not just H2O, but nutrients, seeds, and perhaps most importantly, the people who followed seasonal flows from one abundance to another. Archaeological evidence follows these invisible lines with startling consistency, as if ancient communities understood the landscape's hidden circulatory system and planned their movements accordingly. Along the phantom course of the Great Southern Serpent, researchers consistently find stone tool workshops, campsite remnants, and ritual burial grounds positioned at precise intervals that suggest strategic placement relative to seasonal water flow. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, expanding her expertise from cave art analysis to broader cultural interpretation, has identified what she calls the archaeology of anticipation. Evidence that communities didn't simply react to environmental changes, but actively planned for them based on intimate knowledge of hydrological patterns that modern science has only recently rediscovered. Perhaps most remarkably, these buried river systems preserve actual water, not just the memory of it. Beneath the Great Victoria lies one of the world's largest freshwater aquifers, the Great Artesian Basin's southern extension, containing water that fell as rain during the last ice age. Modern bore wells occasionally tap into this fossil water supply, literally drawing from the same sources that sustained the green civilization 40,000 years ago. Each drop represents a direct connection to that lost world, preserved in darkness like liquid time itself. The sleeping rivers remind us that landscapes have memory, that what appears permanent is often temporary, and that beneath every ending lies the potential for new beginning. These buried arteries still pulse with possibility, waiting patiently for the orbital cycles that will one day call them back to life. And when that time comes, they may once again carry more than water. They may carry the seeds of civilizations yet to be born. In the 21st century, the Great Victoria is being rediscovered not by archaeologists wielding trowels and brushes, but by satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above the Earth's surface. The same instruments that track hurricanes across the Pacific, monitor crop health in distant farmlands, and measure the retreat of polar ice caps are now peering through millennia of accumulated sand to reveal a landscape more complex and purposeful than anyone dared imagine. This digital archaeology represents a revolution in how we explore the past, allowing researchers to excavate entire civilizations without disturbing a single grain of sand. Dr. Catherine Walsh, director of the Australian Remote Sensing Archaeological Program, describes the current era as the golden age of discovery through technology. Her team operates from a climate-controlled facility in Canberra, yet their work uncovers secrets buried beneath some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on the continent. Using synthetic aperture radar that can penetrate several meters of dry sand, multispectral imaging that detects subtle variations in surface temperature, and LiDAR systems that map topographic anomalies invisible to the human eye, Walsh's researchers have identified what can only be described as urban patterns scattered across the eastern and central Great Victoria. From orbital perspective, these patterns begin to emerge like photographs developing in slow motion. Geometric shadows that suggest deliberately constructed boundaries. Faint rectangular grids oriented to cardinal directions with the precision of a surveyor's plan. Circular outlines too regular and extensive to represent natural geological formations. The story of their discovery reads like a detective novel written by computers. In the early 2010s, analysts working with data from the Australian Space Agency's Mineral Survey satellites began noticing anomalies in thermal imaging patterns across the Great Victoria. Perfect straight lines buried under meters of sand, each grid oriented to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy that suggested deliberate human planning rather than random geological processes. Dr. Martin Ashworth, a geophysicist specializing in subsurface detection technology, was among the first to recognize that these patterns defied natural explanation. When Ashworth's team followed up with ground-penetrating radar surveys, their suspicions deepened into certainty. The instruments revealed low stone walls forming courtyards, foundation outlines, and intersecting pathways that spoke unmistakably of urban planning. The images captured through layers of compacted sand showed the skeletal remains of settlements, not temporary camps or seasonal gathering places, but permanent communities designed with the same geometric precision found in the world's earliest known cities. Professor Janet Richfield, an expert in prehistoric urban development at the University of Western Australia, describes these discoveries as evidence of Australia's first experiment with organized settlement. The buried structures show clear signs of hierarchical planning, central areas surrounded by residential zones, with what appear to be defensive perimeters and carefully designed drainage systems that would have channeled precious rainwater through the community during the final wet periods. Machine learning algorithms trained on thousands of archaeological sites worldwide have begun identifying patterns within these buried cities that human eyes might miss. Dr. Elizabeth Farrow, a specialist in digital archaeology at the Australian National University, has developed software that can analyze satellite data and predict the locations of undiscovered structures with remarkable accuracy. Her programs have identified what appear to be road networks connecting separate urban centers across distances of hundreds of kilometers, suggesting that the ancient Great Victoria supported not just isolated settlements, but an interconnected civilization with trade routes, communication systems, and shared cultural practices. The scale of these discoveries challenges every assumption about prehistoric Australia. Rather than small bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers, the evidence points to communities sophisticated enough to engage in long-term planning, resource management, and collaborative construction projects. Some burial complexes show alignments with the same astronomical phenomena marked by the stone observatories, indicating that urban planning incorporated celestial knowledge into practical civic design. The cities weren't randomly positioned across the landscape, but strategically placed along the courses of the great sleeping rivers, positioned to take advantage of seasonal flooding and permanent water sources that sustained urban populations for thousands of years. Yet the most intriguing mystery lies not in what these cities reveal about the past, but in what they might tell us about the future. Carbon dating of organic materials found within the buried structures indicates that these urban centers were abandoned gradually rather than suddenly, suggesting that their inhabitants had time to plan and prepare for the climate changes that would make their homeland uninhabitable. Dr. Patricia Melbourne, whose earlier work traced the genetic legacy of Great Victoria's ancient peoples, believes these cities represent humanity's first conscious experiment with environmental adaptation on a civilizational scale. The urban layouts show clear evidence of water conservation strategies, food storage facilities, and population management systems that would have helped communities survive increasingly harsh conditions. Most remarkably, some of these buried cities show signs of deliberate preservation. Sealed chambers containing artifacts, ritual objects, and what appear to be information storage systems that their creators intended to survive the coming desiccation. These time capsules suggest that the ancient inhabitants of the Great Victoria understood they were living through the end of an era and took steps to ensure their knowledge would survive for future discovery. The precision with which these preservation efforts were executed indicates not just intelligence, but wisdom, the ability to think beyond immediate survival toward the needs of distant descendants. As modern technology continues to unveil these buried metropolises, one question becomes increasingly urgent. If these ancient peoples could foresee and prepare for environmental catastrophe, what lessons might their preparations hold for a world facing similar challenges today? Even when the land forgets, the body remembers. Within every human cell lies a story of migration written in spirals of DNA, a map of ancient journeys etched not in stone tablets or cave paintings, but in the very substance of our flesh. These genetic archives carry information across thousands of generations, preserving memories of landscapes that vanished long before recorded history began, and marking the pathways our ancestors followed as they spread across continents in search of water, shelter, and hope. Dr. Samantha Greenberg, a leading geneticist at the Australian Institute of Human Origins, has spent the last decade sequencing DNA extracted from the ancient remains discovered throughout the Great Victoria. Her laboratory work reads like detective fiction written in the language of chromosomes and mitochondria. When she began analyzing genetic material from the 40,000-year-old burials, she expected to find isolated populations with limited genetic diversity. Instead, her research revealed something extraordinary: clear lineages that could be traced back to ancestors who lived in the green Great Victoria nearly 50,000 years ago, during the earliest phases of human settlement in Australia. These genetic signatures tell a story of remarkable continuity and connection. The DNA extracted from ancient graves scattered across the buried cities shows direct relationships to modern Aboriginal populations, creating an unbroken chain of descent that spans 50 millennia. More remarkably, the genetic evidence reveals that these ancient people were not isolated remnants clinging to survival in a harsh environment, but thriving communities whose descendants carried their knowledge and culture far beyond the boundaries of their homeland. The implications of Greenberg's discoveries extend far beyond academic curiosity into the realm of prophecy and hope. Professor Anthony Caldwell, a climatologist at the University of Melbourne specializing in long-term orbital cycles, has been working closely with the genetic research team to understand how past climate changes might predict future transformations. His computer models reveal that Earth's orbital mechanics operate with clockwork precision, creating predictable cycles of environmental change that have shaped human civilization for hundreds of thousands of years. Every 40,000 years or so, subtle shifts in the planet's axial tilt and orbital eccentricity alter the distribution of solar energy across Earth's surface, causing monsoon systems to migrate and transforming entire continents from desert to garden and back again. Caldwell calls this phenomenon the Great Breathing, and his calculations suggest that we are currently living near the end of an exhalation phase that began when the Great Victoria turned to dust. Within the next 15 to 20 millennia, the orbital mechanics that dried the ancient paradise will reverse their effects, drawing moisture-laden air masses deep into the Australian interior once again. Computer simulations of this coming transformation paint pictures that seem almost too wonderful to believe, yet are grounded in the same astronomical realities that govern the rising and setting of the sun. The models show water pooling once again in the basins of the Great Southern Serpent, filling ancient lake beds that have lain empty for 30 millennia. Grass spreads like green fire across dormant sand dunes, while trees take root in soils that have been waiting patiently for the return of sufficient moisture. Dr. Helen Ashford, an ecologist specializing in ecosystem restoration, has used these climate projections to map how vegetation communities might re-establish themselves across the transformed landscape. Her research suggests that the buried seed banks preserved in desert soils could spring to life within decades of the monsoon's return, creating forests and wetlands that would rival any ecosystem on Earth. Where today there is only endless red emptiness punctuated by the occasional stunted shrub, future generations might walk beneath canopies of eucalyptus and acacia, build settlements beside clear-running streams, and cultivate gardens in soil that has rested for 40,000 years. The cradle of Australia's first civilization would open once more, ready to nurture new communities who might discover in the landscape's restored abundance the same inspiration that once drove ancient astronomers to map the movements of stars and artists to paint their dreams on stone. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of this coming Renaissance lies not in its promise of environmental renewal, but in what it might reveal about human memory and the persistence of knowledge across seemingly impossible spans of time. Dr. Patricia Melbourne, whose earlier research traced the genetic connections between ancient and modern populations, has begun collaborating with traditional Aboriginal knowledge keepers to document stories and practices that might preserve information about the green Great Victoria. Her work suggests that cultural memory can survive climate catastrophes that erase every physical trace of past civilizations. Sacred songs, ceremonial practices, and traditional ecological knowledge passed down through oral tradition may carry practical information about water sources, seasonal patterns, and sustainable land management techniques that could prove invaluable when the rains return. The wind stirs across the desert tonight, carrying fine dust past the moon and stars that guided ancient astronomers in their patient observations. The dunes shimmer like water for an instant under the shifting light, and it feels as though the Great Victoria is whispering, not in sorrow for what has been lost, but in anticipation of what is yet to come. Somewhere beneath the endless red silence, the sleeping rivers wait with infinite patience, their channels preserved like promises written in stone and sand. The desert is not dead. It is dreaming. And when it breathes again, when the monsoon clouds gather once more over the inland sea that stretches from horizon to horizon, the memory of civilization will rise with the waters, ready to teach new generations what their ancestors learned about living in harmony with the earth's eternal rhythms. The Great Awakening is not an ending, but a beginning that has been 40,000 years in the making. Thank you for journeying with us through these forgotten worlds. Sleep well, knowing that beneath every silence lies the seed of future song.